Hi, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Clinton Ford, Director of Product Marketing at Unravel Data, and I'm joined by our guests, Eric Hilman, Cloud Finance Manager at Hilman Associates, Joe Ferrero, FinOps Certified Practitioner at DBGurus, and Don Hilborn, Senior Solutions Engineer at Unravel Data. Thank you for joining us for this live event. So here's a look at today's agenda. We'll start with some recent statistics to set some context for our panel discussion. And following the panel discussion, we will have some time to answer the questions that you enter into the Q&A window. Enterprise software spending rose in 2022, fueled by adoption of cloud and enterprise applications. A Forrester survey of 657 publicly traded software companies forecast that dramatic macroeconomic conditions and other factors will have little to modest impact due to the underlying strength of the software industry fundamentals. Global IT software spending grew faster than overall IT spending as enterprises prioritize spending to capture competitive advantages through increased productivity, automation, and other software-driven transformation initiatives. Deciding whether to build versus buy software solutions is one of the central challenges for IT procurement teams. The initial development time to build custom software typically takes a long time, months or even years. Unfortunately, many studies show that the failure rates of custom software projects ranges between 50 to 80%, meaning that a large portion of custom development projects do not meet their intended goals. So no matter how well a software project is planned and executed, there will always be a need for maintenance work. The software maintenance cycle never ends, and this is because no software is perfect, and there are always changes and updates that need to be made to keep things running smoothly. So now it's my pleasure to welcome our panelists, Eric Hilman, Cloud Finance Manager from Hilman Associates, Joe Ferrero, FinOps Certified Practitioner, DBGurus, and Don Hilborn, a Senior Solutions Engineer on Unravel Data. So glad to have you with us here today. So today we're going to discuss 5 questions to guide build versus buy decisions, and then we will take a look at how this applies to the data observability segment. So the first question we're looking at is the application in question strategic to the acquirer? And so, Eric, let me turn first to you to see what your thoughts are on this question.
Right. So the first question is, what do we mean by strategic? And the idea is strategic applications have some major impact to the business of the acquirer. It could be that it's the embodiment of a core business process or business practice, or it's the essence of their business, for example, a game company. If it's strategic and that important, it's most likely that the company will want to consider a make scenario versus a buy.
Those are really great points, Eric. So Joe, did you have any thoughts about this topic as well?
Yeah, I think it's important to separate between mission critical and transactional based systems, and whether or not what you're trying to achieve. You know, at the end of the day, the investments that you make over time on this new application needs to be outweighed by an increase in revenue or a reduction in cost, perhaps a reduction in risk as well. And so always thinking about what's the all-in cost versus what's the all-in benefit, really understanding the ROI going into it, and knowing that most custom development solutions tend to go over budget, or, as Clinton pointed out, require a lot of maintenance. Is that cost considered as part of the ROI equation?
Right. Another thing you can think about is whether or not the solution is very broad or very narrow. If it's very narrow and much smaller, you might want to consider a make scenario. And if it's a broad solution where the vendors have already done it, that leans you more in the direction of a buy situation.
Fantastic. Thank you, Joe and Eric, both on those points. Don, can you think of any examples where this comes into play? and how this is playing out in the situations that you hear from customers.
Yeah, what I see with customers is when something is strategic, it's generally something they're working on that's specific to their business. It's creating value. For example, if they're an oil and gas company, it's creating value in the way they process and produce oil and gas. And then the other thing is, does the organization itself have specialized knowledge that really requires that they differentiate what they're doing from any generic problem that exists out there? When I see generic problems are what the issue is, what the strategic system or non-strategic system is looking to do, often there are other companies out there that have already solved those generic problems because there are multiple companies that face them. So, for example, when I was at Compaq, originally we used PL SQL to work on our data warehouse, and we saw that as very strategic and it was very important. And I remember when Informatica back then, it was PowerMark 4.7 came in, and they had this really cool tool that was all visual. And initially I said, well, this code is very strategic for us. It's basically populating our data warehouse, but writing that code and maintaining that code didn't necessarily bring value that an ETL tool in this particular instance could. And ultimately that ETL tool would become something that we would use strategically as far as the data that passed through it. But as far as moving data from point A to point B, cleaning it up, normalizing it, whatever you want to do, those are very generic problems that a company faces. And often there are platforms out there that will solve that for them, that it may not be specific to their strategy as an organization, but it does help them be able to differentiate what's specific to their organization and what is generic that they can solve with some of these existing platforms that are out there.
Excellent. Thank you, Don. Now, Joe, any thoughts here in terms of like how the cloud makes a difference in terms of how we approach this challenge?
Yeah, I've been doing this long enough that companies that used to exist solely in the cloud. That's a phenomenon that's come across obviously in the last 15 to 20 years. But when you think about it, every commercial enterprise wants to present a unique benefit, a unique value add, something that segments them from the rest of the marketplace. And if your primary storefront, if your primary interaction with customers is online, right? That's something you absolutely want to make unique. You don't want to rely on a package to do. You want to make it unique and special so that you can put forward that value add, that special something that you offer as a commercial enterprise that hopefully nobody else in the market is offering, or that you can do it better. And so that's the other thing to consider as well. Invest where you need uniqueness and not on applications that are as Don described, kind of similar to what other companies in your position might be using as well.
Excellent. Really appreciate those points. Okay, on to our next question. Does the vendor have more expertise than you do? Eric, have you ever encountered this as you've been making these decisions in the past?
Right, sure. So very often the commercial vendors have the expertise and they make it available to all comers. And at that point, you're buying their expertise, even if it's important to your business. I mean, the best example I can think of is SAP, where you're buying the expertise in ERP systems from the SAP people. So it made no sense to think about making something in that scenario. It was a very big situation, and the vendor had all the expertise that we needed.
Oh, great to take that into consideration. Now, Joe, what about your perspective here in terms of the environment in which this is operating?
I know we're going to get into artificial intelligence, AI applications later, but I think it's important to understand how dynamic or static your environment is. And what I mean by that is, if you're the industry leader and you've got a really good feel for the marketplace and you have a good feel for where it's going to go over the next 3 to 5 years, you might have a relatively static environment. But if you're emerging in a new market, or there's a lot of competition in your market, or there's other industry niches pressing in on your market. You might have a very dynamic market where you need to change things out fairly quickly. And so that goes back into Clinton, your earlier slide about maintenance. You could build something and then have it out of date in 6 or 9 months if you are in a really dynamic market. And so that's part of what you want to consider as well, right? Which is, do you let the vendor update that and try to stay with the industry trends and the things that are going on? Or is that something you're going to be able to manage because you have such great market share, such great insight to the future of your industry and your marketplace that you'll be able to anticipate those and get them to market ahead of your competitors?
Right, and sometimes what happens is the vendor has the core expertise, and you might want something around the edges to enhance it or make it tuned for your particular application, or maybe you have a particular way of thinking about a particular problem that maybe the vendor hasn't thought about. So rather than do the entire application, just do an add-on. Most systems these days have great import, export, and API capability to let you get the data in and out, and do a bolt-on capability as needed.
Great suggestion, Eric. How about you, Don? Any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, here again, I would look to what is the business? What are we as a company an expert in? And then what potentially is the vendor an expert in? So at Boeing, for example, there were not software engineers per se that built out Boeing's systems, because they didn't want to be experts in building out internal systems that they used. And there were certainly many different companies out there that provided that type of software or that type of platform. But if you do have expertise in that area, so for example, with data scientists, building out models specific to your business that can be a differentiator in the market, you may have data scientists that have a great expertise in your area, your particular industry. And of course, building out those models would be very valuable. However, you may find that there's other things that potentially have already been done that you don't have to kind of reinvent the wheel. And you can look to existing models or existing examples of what it is you're trying to do from an organization as far as making predictions or however you're using AI. But there again, in building out those models, the tools or the platforms that exist out there, you don't want to reinvent that. That's not something that you're going to really want your data scientist or your people, for that matter, to be experts in, because there are platforms out there that you can use to help build out those models and ultimately move them through CI/CD and into production. So there's no need for you to acquire those expertise or use them to build out a solution. You can simply go out and leverage the expertise that already exists in that area. So I think that it kind of goes back a little bit to the first question. Is this something that's strategic? Do we have specific insight that we can build models that can differentiate us? So are we like an Airbnb, who is the largest hotel chain in the world, but they own no hotels, or Uber, all of them using data, but they're not out there reinventing systems to process that data and build out the models. The differentiator is in having the data scientists that are knowledgeable of your business build out models, and that can become a significant differentiator for you. And of course, by purchasing from a vendor that has the expertise in building out this type of software, you're able to do that more effectively and at greater scale, which of course creates more value from that very specific data science knowledge that someone must have to be a data scientist, say in Boeing's aeronautics division or something like that. So that's the way I look at it.
Great, thank you, Don. Appreciate each of your viewpoints on this one. All right, let's go to our next question. Is the acquirer prepared to incur those costs and bear the costs and risks of development and support of a homegrown tool? Any thoughts on this one, Eric, in terms of, build versus buy, and how you think about the development as well as ongoing support costs for it?
Sure. So I guess there's two cases, right? There's the case of building a full application. And if you're building a full large application, the development costs are going to be large. It's going to take a long time from a schedule perspective, again, depending on the scope. And there's lots and lots of risks. We can talk about risks of really understanding the requirements. There's technical risks. There's staff risks, so that people really have the right skills to do this. In some cases, it's a budgetary constraint. In some cases, it's a strategic constraint. Startups maybe have investment money that they've committed to their investors to address the business at hand and not build some smaller IT tool, lest they get caught in shifting their business focus. So you really have to think long and hard about risks and schedule and costs when thinking about a make scenario for a large application. Now, the second thing is just making a small piece of it, and that could be much more reasonable to say the application does 98% of what I want to do, but there's this extra 2%, and it's just easier to have my team go build that, and that makes a lot of sense sometimes.
Yeah, great point. How about from your perspective, Joe? Any thoughts on how to decide about this important question?
Yeah, I agree with what Eric said, and I think it's important to understand too that even if you buy a packaged solution, you're not you will still have technical effort that's required to make that work. And I usually refer to this as ICE, in terms of ICE being I for integration, C for customization, and E for enhancement. Eric talked a little bit earlier about the enhancement capability, building a bolt-on to build that extra 2% or build out what the vendor doesn't provide. But there's also the integration to your other core applications that needs to be completed, as well as the data conversion and any customizations based on the customer or based on the vendor's configuration option. And so those things all require technical talent. So it's not like it's a development effort versus no development effort. It's a large development effort versus a smaller development effort that's supported by a vendor. And so that's the way I think you need to look at it as well. So I agree with the assessment Eric provided, which is look at what the vendor provides and how much of your heat map or functional map does it cover, and then can you build out the rest of it and or configure the application to do it, and then can you properly integrate it into your current application portfolio.
Oh, terrific. Really appreciate that perspective, Joe. How about from your side, Don? Any thoughts on how to go about this, solving the answer to this question?
I think first and foremost, you have to really look at the cost. Often we don't recognize the full cost of something until we're actually doing it. And then, of course, given that, are there any risks in you developing this technology or this solution for your organization? And then ultimately, care and feeding the support. Is this something that you're willing to do? I'll give an example of a company that I worked for that they were a software company, and they were looking to build a solution for their solution engineers, people like me, for example, to help track our time and keep up with what we're spending most of our time on, etc. Well, there was a solution out there already built. It's called Hero, but we decided to build it ourselves. And very quickly, we realized that really wasn't where our expertise were, right? We were building out software for big data and other things. And now we had engineers that were kind of dedicating themselves to this application. And it took a while, much longer than anybody had ever anticipated, therefore the expensive cost, for them to build it out and really get it to a point where it was even comparable to what was out there on the market. But then, of course, when it came to ongoing support and maintaining it, there was a whole nother set of costs that really weren't fully considered. And it wasn't long before ultimately that internal system was abandoned and just going out and buying a dedicated system to that. Sometimes as engineers, people will think, hey, we can do anything, we can build it ourselves. But is that really what you want? And have you considered the cost that you will incur in totality, how much it will cost to support it on an ongoing basis, and to keep it current? Because generally, if there are solutions out there, if that's what that company focuses on, they're evolving its capabilities very quickly. And so if you want to be comparable with your internal solution, there's kind of that ongoing development. And I think when you look at those things holistically, you'll be able to make a great decision on whether or not you should do something yourself internally or buy a solution that's out there.
Oh, fantastic feedback on that. So Eric, when you think about this question about costs and who bears the risk, have you come across any creative approaches to solving this so that you get the benefits of homegrown without having to bear all the risk and development cost?
All right, that's what we were just talking about, partnering with the vendor. I mean, sometimes if you're a big customer, you can encourage the vendor to go build something as an extra feature to a package they have, or even as a unique package. Or sometimes, as we had mentioned, the package needs to be customized, and either you pay the vendor to do that customization or you do it yourself. Different ways to get the additional functionality that you need so you can get the return on investment that you're looking for.
Interesting. So it's almost like the vendor is an outsourced development team at that point. Is that right?
I've seen a scenario where that works, and the vendor comes in selling a package, and the company I was involved with said, hey, we really need you to do something 20% to the left of that. And the vendor was able to learn from the company and actually tune up their product to do what they needed to do.
That's fantastic. And then Joe, what about from your side? Have you seen any metrics or measures that you would put in place in order to judge either before the decision is made or in the process of rolling it out to see if you've made the right decision and course correct?
Yeah, I think you would start with a kind of the 80-20 rule that, is the vendor going to cover 80% of your base requirements, right? Of your current base requirements, can the vendor meet that? Depending on the application, you might expect it to get to 95, say on a accounting application, and maybe something less, closer to 50% on an order management application. But in general, I think 80% is a good target. And then I think using the agile methodology, you can really course correct as you go down. You'll have certain stories and certain requirements that are easy to develop or easy to configure, and others that are going to require additional work. And then you prioritize those against the other similar requirements that are out there in order to figure out what you can get to market in the timeline you have, and what are the trade-offs across those. So I think those are all the things I would be looking at.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you, Joe. And any other comments? Did you have something else, Eric, on that one?
No.
Okay. And then Don, any thoughts on if you need to get going quickly, based on your experience with that example you provided, any thoughts on what do you think is the fastest way to get going? And is it, a short sprint of development, or, is it purchasing an off-the-shelf product? What do you see as the fastest route?
Well, generally, yes, purchasing an off-the-shelf product tends to be faster. There may be things that you can be doing in advance, and I guess this goes to what both Eric and Joe said is, let's say, for example, that this application is going to require interoperability with other applications that you can go ahead and write, say, the API calls to, and then when the application is installed and configured, that integration will be taken care of. But generally, I found if you do try to pursue something internally, especially in my example, where it's not really core to your business. So even though we were full of software engineers, developing systems that allowed us to track our SEs or SAs was not what they were really specialized in. And so I think if you're going to go try and recreate that yourself, and I've actually seen it at multiple companies, it tends to take much longer than it would to just go out and buy a solution that's already taken care of what you need, or most of what you need. Like I said, for example, if you need to build out integration or other things, well, given the fact that that's not a significant amount of work, probably while you're working with the vendor, negotiating prices and all that good stuff, you can go ahead and build out those API calls so that once you bring that solution into your environment, it's interoperable with the other applications in your environment. So, but yeah, if you are going to start, if you're kind of dedicated, then I think the example that really I think Joe gave, right, is you may want to look at a story, you may want to look at an epic, you may want to focus in on some very early tasks that you can get wins from very quickly, and then you would evolve the system over time. So you would likely not have as many capabilities as that external system or shrink wrapped, we used to call it, solution, but you can get there over time incrementally, and maybe that's all you need. If the low-hanging fruit that you can solve very quickly or address very quickly, if that's the majority of what you're trying to do, then yeah, maybe starting out with something that addresses those low-hanging fruits that you're trying to address, and going forward with that, and then over time continue to evolve and augment the capabilities of the platform or solution.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Don. All right, on to our next question. Are the applications in the marketplace affordable and have suitable mix of features and functions? Eric, what are your thoughts on this, or what experience have you had with making this choice? Oh, sorry, Eric, I think you're on mute still.
Sorry about that. I started to say sometimes the applications that are in the marketplace are large and sometimes expensive, and the acquirer may or may not need a very large application to start with. So maybe it makes sense to build something small, as Don was just alluding to, and then later on evolve to something larger as the need arises. I mean, this is well documented by a book by Clayton Christensen called The Innovator's Dilemma, where IBM made large mainframes, and the IBM salesmen were used to selling $1 million items, and some the smaller mini supercomputer or super mini computer vendors of the time were offering much smaller solutions that address the customer's need just fine. But to the larger company, they were saying, oh, well, that's a toy. That's not very good for what we're used to doing. And in that case, if you're dealing with an innovator's dilemma and the vendors don't want to play ball, it might be appropriate to make that piece of it, and maybe make it in such a way that you can partner with a vendor and spin it out later on.
Oh, that's a great suggestion. Joe, how about from your perspective? What are your thoughts on this question?
I think the software procurement cycle is really important here. Even if you're tending towards building a custom application, going through at least an RFI period where you go out and look at the vendors in the marketplace, see what they're doing, and more importantly, see where their roadmaps are, see where they're going with their products, and make sure that you've considered all the things that you're going to need for your business, along with where the money is going in the packaged software world, so that you can see where people are spending their development dollars and get a feel for how important that is to you. Maybe not today, but maybe 18 months or 2 years, 3 years out, to make sure that you're considering everything as you get going on your custom development effort. That said, all the other things that are important is not just understanding the roadmap, but also how open the platform is. Do they have the APIs? Do they have the development tools so you can enhance and build up the platform if the vendor isn't going to offer features that are mission critical to you, either available upon purchase or soon thereafter.
Oh, excellent point.
And you can't forget the maintenance costs, right? Anytime you do your own thing, you're going to incur serious maintenance costs over a long period of time.
Yeah, really good point.
How about from your side,
Yeah, and
Don?
I think along with that is we talked about earlier, dynamic versus static environment, right? That in the cloud world, if you're a single cloud company today and you have ambitions to be a multi-cloud company, that's there. If you're an acquisitive company and you're going to be acquiring companies, those are all things that are going to change your requirements, and you're going to need to be able to adapt to them relatively quickly.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe. How about from your side, Don? Any thoughts on this question and how to address it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key words here are affordability and features and functions. Affordability is really a matter of the cost versus the benefit. You can't simply look at the price and say, oh, that's too expensive or that's really inexpensive. You have to look at how much value is this going to bring to your organization in total, and then make a decision based on what it costs relevant to that value. But the features and functions, of course, are also important. You have to look at, does it do everything I need it to do today? Is there something on the roadmap where some of the things that I'm looking for are definitely in the planning stage or will be there eventually? But you also, it requires you to do the analysis of, well, what features and functions do you really need? And I think this was Eric's point earlier, as well as Joe made this point. Often when we're looking at the value of applications externally and internally, when it comes to the internal application, it's very difficult for us to actually know the full cost of doing that internally. We're guessing at it to some extent. But that external application has a very specific defined cost, and even ongoing support costs are well defined for you. And sometimes just having that clarity up front and knowing more about this particular application than what's even possible for you to do internally. Sometimes the fact that it is a fixed price, there is something associated with support, and you know what that is, sometimes that can really lean you in the direction of kind of going with the known as opposed to the unknown. So that's another thing to consider, is most likely when you're evaluating external applications and thinking of doing it internally, it's very difficult to forecast out the total cost and the total support required for that internal application.
Oh, that's a great point. Thank you so much, Don. All right, on to our next question, our fifth question. Are the applications on the market generally suitable for purchase? So Eric, what would exclude an application or a vendor from the list? Are there any things that you would put into this category?
Right. So it's exclude the application for purchase by your organization. I've worked with some government clients, and they have some particular concerns about ADA compliant on the user interface, or specific security requirements or scalability, have user-friendly kinds of requirements. Usually these things are, as you might call them, jacks or better, and the vendors are doing everything correctly, but not always. So you have to consider, is the application suitable for your organization at this time? And if not, can you negotiate with the vendor to add in these kinds of things, these non-functional requirements? Hopefully you can, but if it's a problem, then you have to consider other alternatives.
Oh, great points. Joe, from your perspective, any thoughts here on determining suitability?
Yeah, I agree with everything Eric said. I think most large enterprises have a checklist of things they have to meet before they consider bringing an application from the outside, mostly around security, but also infrastructure, things like that. But I think there's also a key component in the software world, which is vendor maturity and financial stability, right? Which is looking at a company, do they have 10 customers, 100 customers, 1,000 customers? Do they have an ongoing revenue run rate that's going to keep them alive during difficult times and keep them enhancing and building their product? Or are they a startup really looking for the first dozen clients to figure out the marketplace? One obviously has more risk than the other, but understanding both the customer's current market position and their financial stability, I think is really important as well when you're considering a purchase. What you don't want to do is get 18 months and $2 million into a project and then have the vendor say, hey, we're going out of business, we didn't get our round C funding, right? You don't ever want to be in that situation. So you want to look at the ongoing viability of each of the vendors you're considering, along with the items Eric mentioned.
Yeah, good points, Joe. And would you also agree that you want to look at have they had success with those customers as well to make a determination?
Really good point. Yeah, I should have mentioned that probably first, right? Is, you check your references, make sure the customers are satisfied with what they've received today, and that they have confidence in the vendor's path forward.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Joe. How about from your perspective, Don?
Yeah, I have to agree with Joe and Eric completely on this. It has to do with the vendor themselves. How stable are they? How many customers do they have? How happy are those customers? And things like, well, what is their support policy? And are they even able to offer that support given their size or other aspects of the organization? And then the software or the application itself that you're looking to buy, there used to be a rule, never buy version 1 of software, which was kind of interesting because some companies started coming out with their first version, but they would say it's version 4.7 or something like that. And so that rule became very difficult. But yeah, what's the maturity of the application? How long have they been working on it? And what's the evolution of features? That's another thing that's important when you're looking at these applications is you're signing up really with that vendor for a journey because you guys are going to be journeying together forward. You're going to be using their application and they're going to hopefully be evolving it with more and more features and functions. And that would be another thing that you would look at is how has that worked within this particular vendor? Are they consistently evolving and adding significantly new capabilities? Or has the application been static since they developed it 5 years ago and they're not really evolving it or doing anything with it? And if that's the case, then maybe they're not the best partner to journey with going forward to provide you the functionalities and the features that you're looking for in their application.
Oh, really good response there, Don. Appreciate your perspective on that. It's great. Okay, on to our next slide. So Eric, do you want to share a little bit about this build versus buy approach?
Well, sure. So this is kind of a summary of a number of considerations that we talked about. I mean, time to market and risk and all the other ones that are listed here. And the idea is if these concerns aren't overwhelming, then go ahead and buy. If it's a strategic issue, then you may want to go ahead and build it subject to the limitations of some of these other issues. So if you build it, it's more likely to take longer than if you buy it. If you build it, it might cost you more in the short term, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea is buy if you can, make if you must. And these are some of the constraints, the questions to ask yourself as to whether or not make or buy makes sense in this particular situation.
This is such a helpful resource. Thank you, Eric, putting this together. Okay, so Don, over to you. Do you want to talk a little bit about why managing cloud costs is so difficult?
Yeah, this is something near and dear to my heart because I've been working in the cloud for, I guess, a little over 10 years now. And this has always been an issue. And in some ways it gets better, but in other ways it gets more challenging. And part of that is the environments themselves tend to be quite diverse. And the costs that you incur can differ based on what combination of assets in the cloud you're using. So you have these very complex environments and the assets that are being used within them have different pricing and being able to keep up with all of that and understand that in totality, this is how much it costs us to run a particular workload or something like that. That can be very different, very difficult in the cloud world, of course, as compared to on-prem, where you bought the hardware and then the cost was the ongoing support. The other thing is if you've ever gotten one of these cloud bills from one of the cloud providers and you're a significant size organization doing a significant amount of activity in the cloud, it can be very granular where just going through it the first time, it'd be 70 pages of this detailed billing, and making sense of that isn't necessarily easy because the cloud provider's just providing it to you almost like a list of what their cloud assets are and what you paid for them. But what you're often looking to do is look at a particular workload, something from end to end, and say, okay, how much did that cost me? And is it worth it? So that generally you can't get that, even though these bills are quite granular. And then the fact that it's easy to provision in the cloud, a lot of people that permission has been taken away, but that of course sets its own set of problems or creates its own set of problems. But yeah, it's just real easy for anyone to go in and stand up a cloud asset and it's costing you money. The question is, do they really need that asset? Did they leave it running longer than what they needed? But like the point is it is easy. And because of that, you tend to get a lot of people standing up resources, using them, and then not being able to differentiate between who they are, what they're working on, etc., can be a real challenge. There's always change in cloud offerings. Like I described earlier, these clouds are evolving quite quickly. And generally, the successful software companies within the cloud are evolving quite quickly. And because of that, your pricing only gets more and more complex. All of a sudden, there's maybe a different engine or something else that they're charging you some type of premium for. Maybe you want to use that, maybe you don't. Maybe it doesn't create the value as far as the cost. And then there's always different ways of architecting things. You can probably find in most organizations several different architectures, even of their data ecosystem. Either people taking different approaches or in some cases isolated solutions that the organization doesn't even recognize exist. So having all these potential architectures and the diversity of the cloud, again, makes it hard to say, okay, well, what is the data ecosystem actually costing me? Because there's people over here with this architecture pointing to the data lake, and there's a group over here with this architecture pointing to the data lake. It's hard for me to kind of reconcile those two so that I can effectively, again, determine what something is costing me and therefore decide whether or not it's worth it. And then really the cloud platforms are very different, not only from a user experience, but simply from what they offer and how they offer it, and more importantly, how they ultimately price it and share that with you. And that can become another issue because I'm seeing more and more multi-cloud strategies. And so the fact that the clouds themselves are inconsistent makes it very difficult to bring that data together to look at, say, the cost of a particular activity. And those standardizations are probably only going to drift further and further apart because as the clouds become more and more evolved, there's going to be different types of pricing introduced and different types of assets. And you hear things about serverless, and there's always these evolving capabilities that each cloud is doing separately and at a different rate that can make it complex, again, to look at and understand what is this particular thing costing me and is it worth it?
That's fantastic, Don. Thank you for sharing that. So now let's take this question about build versus buy into the realm of cloud data observability. And so let's take a look at that. And Don, do you have some thoughts on why it's different or how it's different for cloud data observability?
Yes, I do. The slide you're seeing before you is really just one application. And as you might imagine, this is not actually a very complex application. I've seen applications that have thousands and thousands of these tables, jobs, various assets that you're running in your data ecosystem. And again, that can become quite complex to manage. And of course, being able to have visibility into that, to identify where there may be applications or tables or other assets that aren't performing optimally. Often as a data engineer for most of my career, and my goal a lot of times was, okay, the code ran and it does what we expect it to do. We're ready to go to production because I've got this huge stack of stuff that I've got to continue working on. But spending time optimizing and identifying where improvements can be made, not only in my contribution to the overall application, but the overall application in totality, being able to look at those individual assets and assess whether or not they're running optimally, whether or not they're structured optimally is very important. And you'll hear this more and more, kind of the FinOps of the cloud, being able to do that on extremely complex systems that have thousands, even tens of thousands in some cases, of these objects becomes unmanageable very, very quickly. The other thing that I see is that this is nice. It's all in one place, right? This looks to me very interesting and it's great. I know it's all in the same cloud and we built this all out. But in some instances, even in the same cloud, you're going to use different resources. So if you're in AWS, you may use Databricks for certain things, but you may discover that EMR is actually better from a cost perspective for what you need to do. So you use EMR. And now you've got two different core applications in your pipeline and building out that pipeline. Being able to manage and monitor that, as well as identify what needs to take place for that to be able to scale, becomes extremely difficult. And we were talking about expertise earlier, but all of a sudden you've got these entire teams trying to integrate this data together and get it to you in a way that, to get it to the end user in a way that says, hey, here's how much it's costing us to do X. That becomes very difficult in these complex environments. And EMR is just one example. You'll have a business intelligence tool. You may have a identity management tool. You may have a dashboarding tool. Ultimately, all of those should be considered when looking at the cost of some particular application and whether or not it's worth what we're spending on it. So this is a definition by Gartner, so I assume you can read it, so I won't reread it for you. But really, if you think about it, data observability is data about your data in many ways, right? It's kind of the metadata definition, but it's really looking for some very specific things, in this case, in a data operations environment, in data ops. So do you have a holistic view of all your data that you can look at and work on that data to determine whether or not it's quality, whether or not changes need to be made? Looking at that holistically, again, given the complexity of these systems, can be very difficult. But these observability tools, they offer up kind of this multi-dimensional view of your data, so you can really do analysis not only on the cost and the performance, but the data itself, and being able to find issues in data quality or other things is very important. But then, like I said earlier, well, what about performance? What about the quality of the usage? And that's another thing, is how do we gather that? How do we know whether or not this is the most performant job that it could be? And of course, there are platforms out there, data observability platforms, that can give you that insight and help you determine, is this really the optimal way to do this? Not just from an individual pipeline, but holistically, are we using this most optimally? Which can be very challenging. A lot of people find it, in some cases, their cost has increased as they've moved to the cloud from their data center. And really, that should not be the case. It's probably that they're not really optimizing a lot of their pipelines or data processing, and therefore it's much more costly than it needs to be. And then, of course, being able to determine what the impact's going to be to downstream systems as you're moving through this. How is what's about to happen impacting them? So for example, you may have a data observability platform that is able to look at a job that's running and basically let you know that, hey, you're going to run out of time before you run out of processing. In other words, you've set up some guardrails for us. And given the way this job is running and the resources that it's using, you're not going to be able to process the data within the window that you want to process it. So what do you want to do? And that insight can be offered in real time in many instances. In other words, while the job is running, you can kind of let them know that, hey, this isn't as efficient as it could be. And again, as a data engineer, that's a blessing, right? If as my job is running, I can go in and make some changes or make some changes and restart it just because of some insight one of these observability tools has provided to me, that's going to be key. For example, I worked with McKesson for a while and built out big data systems for them. And there were some regulations that changed where ultimately, as a provider or as a payer, McKesson is kind of all of those, you had to make sure that the customer, the client, the patient's data was available to them within 24 hours. That was under Obamacare that came out. And it was taking us 3 days to process the data at that point. But if, for example, we got the process optimized and it was running well within 24 hours, I would certainly want to set up a guardrail for that to say, hey, if this is going to exceed 24 hours based on what you're seeing now, let me know, because that's going to be a real problem, because then we're going to run into issues where we can potentially be fined. So that would have been these observability tools would have been the perfect solution to that. Of course, they didn't really exist at the time, so we weren't able to use it, but I could certainly see where they would be valuable in that situation. So what are the business problems that are addressed by data observability? And some of these have been in place for quite some time. I think if you look at these, you'll recognize all of them. And like I said, they've been in place for a while, but what we're starting to see with these data observability tools is we can look at this data more real time, more holistically, and act on it where we maybe weren't able to before. Of course, there's huge growth in data engineering. It's been a great field for me to be involved in, but there's always a talent shortage out there, not just for data scientists, but for data engineers and even sysops or data ops people. And even though we've experienced that growth, you have to build solutions or leverage solutions that just takes into account that these aren't some infinite asset that you can just keep adding on incrementally as you need. In some cases, you're not going to be able to do that in a timely manner. And so you have to keep kind of that ongoing talent shortage and take it into account when you're analyzing your costs. And then, of course, a lot of time is spent by people like me or other people, data scientists, for example, or business analysts, fighting issues. So a data scientist comes to me and says, hey, this data is dirty, it's not what it should be. And I have to go find out, well, how did it get dirty? Where did it come from? Was the problem there? Was the problem in the transformation? And that we're often spending a lot of time just figuring out why this particular column is inaccurate. There's also times when you're, like I said earlier, you're trying to run something and all of a sudden it's not running in the performant mode that it seemed to be running in the past. And now you've got to go look at what's going on and see if something has changed, or you need to make changes to the pipeline. And then you have just plain old job failures and why they failed. And because of a lot of these solutions in the big data space in the cloud were often created initially as like an open source solution, and then the vendor would take it and make it specific to them. But given that, you don't have the best error logging or the best user guidance in tracking down problems in your job while it's failing, etc. So it can be challenging just to understand, okay, what went wrong and where did it go wrong. So they're certainly getting better about that, but that is something that's still a challenge. And then, of course, I think every company I was at before coming to Unravel, we're all focused on cloud costs, and all of our customers were focused on cloud costs, because it was one thing to kind of get your things to the cloud, but now you have to optimize those things. And so you're probably spending more money than you need to get the work done. That's what we found. And certainly that was my experience too in my prior organizations. As you saw earlier, you saw the graph where there's kind of this increasing complexity of not only the data pipelines, but the data stack itself, looking at the network, the storage, the instance type. All of those things are only getting more and more complex. There's more and more instance types. There's more and more options for storage. And then, of course, when all of those are brought together to solve a particular problem, it gets quite complex. And what these observability tools do is they actually look at the full stack. So your vendor may be able to provide you insight into their application, but these observability platforms will not only look at their application, but the underlying infrastructure, the underlying storage, and help you make sure that that's running in the most performant way. So AI for data observability. Let's talk about that real quick. So, of course, we're all seeing more and more AI being used, and with OpenAI especially, right? More and more people now. Everybody's very excited about doing data science or AI. I can remember in the early days of Databricks and even Hortonworks, it was still kind of something that was there, and we knew it was going to grow into something. But it seems most recently that it's become very popular with the general public, and more they're becoming knowledgeable of it. Well, of course, we at Unravel, for example, we use AI-powered recommendations. So are you actually looking at all of that data that you're gathering and just creating a very simplistic rule that helps make recommendations, helps you understand how to improve the quality of that, helps you meet your SLAs? Well, ideally, actually, AI can help with a lot of that. You can run this data through these internal AI engines that these observability platforms have, and it will actually tell you that doing a particular activity is going to save you roughly 30%. As well as whether or not you have an instance, for example, that's optimized. AI can just look at the general activity of that and be able to tell you that this instance is not necessarily is optimized. And then, of course, the quality of data or the quality of the pipeline causing problems? Is the data that's coming through, as the observability tool looks at it, is that what you expect? Are your pipelines running as optimally as they can? But inconsistencies in the data, really, in looking at that, looking at the downstream dependencies that these observability tools know exist, they can kind of look at that in total and tell you whether or not you've got a problem with, say, the quality of your data, a mismatch in the number of rows, etc. So what does excellence look like? I think this is a question that almost always asked when dealing with customers, right? So what does great look like to you? What are your expectations here? And with these observability tools, as I mentioned earlier, you can create guardrails, you can create automated actions. There's things that you can do to help you achieve this goal or your goal. And with the observability platforms, you can recognize whether or not you are meeting those expectations. So if, for example, you're looking to improve spend efficiency, you can set goals around that. And then with these observability tools, You can either look for things that are going to tell you that you're probably not going to meet that goal given your current burn rate, and basically make you, the customer, aware of the problems that it sees, and in some instances, exactly what you need to do to fix it, recommending an actual solution. And you can do this same thing with productivity. Are people being more productive in the time they use these cloud resources? And you can, again, with these observability tools, you can look at the activity of certain individuals, and you can actually see, are they getting the same amount of work done, but with fewer resources, with shorter running jobs? And how much time are they actually spending in the system? And what have they created? What assets have moved to production? You can look at that type of information, and you can decide, are we being more productive, not only from the jobs or the activities that we're running in the cloud, but actually the people that are using the cloud. Are they able to use the data that's generated by these observability platforms to be more productive? And then, of course, even your SLA with your customers or internal SLAs that you have, you can try to ensure that you're meeting those SLAs. So my example earlier about McKesson and the new law, well, is this job running in less than 24 hours or not? If it's not, then we've got a big problem as it approaches 24 hours. So we might want to set some thresholds earlier, right? Because if we're starting to see it approach 24 hours, we may need to go make changes to the application. And of course, there's always more data coming in. There's always more and more complex data. And that's where you might see that the pipeline itself is slowing down over time. So you have to deal with those data issues more effectively. I think I'll turn it back to you, Clinton.
Thank you so much, Don. Really appreciate that. And we invite each of you as attendees to learn more about data observability and how it can help you improve your data pipeline performance, reliability, and governing cloud costs by visiting our website and taking a look at this ebook about data observability, the reality, up on our website. And now it looks like we've had some questions come in. So let's jump over to some Q&A. Okay, so Joe, starting with you, we have a question here from a participant. How do you address the iron triangle of software quality, speed, or also known as time to market, and cost? So yeah, quality, speed, and cost. Joe, what are your thoughts on that?
You're on mute.
Yeah, thanks, Quentin. Yeah, I like the group of three, quality, speed, and time to market. And I'll put it in terms of another group of three, right, which is methodology and leadership and scope, right? And I think really what it is using the agile methodology. You can really look at all the activities and all the requirements that need to be filled, and rank them one against each other. And that really helps you in terms of priority, communicate to senior management what's going on. And then have a cross-functional team, and you're identifying the right scope. It's really about the leadership coming in and saying, here's what's most important to us, given the resources and given the time that we have. And then if that's not going to fulfill the business needs, have the information, what's being not just done, what's being left behind, to go back and argue for more time, more resources, if that's required. So everything kind of moves together, but if you have the right methodology, you have the right leadership, and you have the right team, you can have the right communication among all of those, really have the right answer to running those trade-offs.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joe. So Eric, here's a question for you. Let's see, have you ever encountered a budget overrun for a custom enterprise software project? If so, what did you learn from that experience, and how has it changed your approach to your build versus buy decisions?
Right, I didn't lose my hair over nothing. Of course, we've had overruns. So let me address it in kind of two ways here. I mean, the why of the overruns, and then what can we learn from that? And the why kind of Initially, it was underestimated for a variety of reasons. People didn't understand it, or sometimes the team wanted to do the project and they didn't want to be as forthcoming about what the cost really was going to be. There's issues of agreement of what the functionality really should be and whether it should be in Rev 1 versus Rev Next. So lack of communication can be an issue. I've seen some issues of tools and expertise where the team says, oh, yeah, we understand that tool that we're using. And then when they go to start using it, they find out it's a lot more complex than they thought. Another issue, we talked about a huge percentage of the IT department budget being for maintenance. And I've seen some of these innovative projects be interrupted by a maintenance emergency, and resources had to get pulled off to go respond to the emergency at hand. And then, of course, there's the age-old scope creep. Management decided, oh, yeah, well, while you're building it, can you build a few more features for us? So the net of it is buy when you can, build when you must, and get creative. And by get creative, I mean do some partnership, offload to the vendors, do whatever you can to kind of mitigate the risk.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Eric. And Don, a question that came in that I think would be great for you to answer. There's a question about, is there a litmus test to tell whether or not a software application is core to your business strategy?
Yeah, I think to come up with a pure litmus test, it would probably be challenging, but I think you can. Some of the questions that we were discussed earlier really address that. But just to reiterate, the first question I would ask as part of the litmus test is what we're looking to build core to our business? So that example I used where a software used for tracking solutions engineers' time is not core to a software engineering company that's building other types of software. So even though they're very capable of building that, it becomes apparent very quickly that, well, this really isn't core to what we're trying to do. It's not our business. I saw this in the oil and gas industry as well, there's always engineers willing to build applications. I'll give an example of when I was at Boeing. I'll never forget this. Is one of the electrical engineers on the space station had built out an application in Access. And he contacted me one day completely flustered. And he said, when I was accessing this application by myself, everything was running perfectly. But when the 400 other engineers started using that access, everything seemed to be broken. And I explained to him why that was the case. So that's another thing you've got to look at is, do you have the expertise even to really build out a solution? If you don't understand software engineering, for example, you might not be the best person to build out a software solution. And then I think the other thing that you look at is whether or not this is something that on an ongoing basis, you want to evolve and keep current. I think you've got to take that into account, as well as making sure that this isn't going to, in the end, cost you more to build than, say, would a purchased solution. The other thing I would consider that we talked about earlier is there really a differentiator for you in the market if you build out this particular solution? So back to the example of models when it comes to machine learning, it's likely that there are specific models that are very specific to your business, your industry, and you have proprietary knowledge that may make those much more effective than if you just tried to use OpenAI or tried to buy something on the market. So that really is another thing that I would look at is this something that maybe it is our core business, but is it really something that's going to differentiate us from our competitors? Is it something where we really need the very specific application functionality? Or using the generic example, is there something out there that's already been built and it solves this problem because it's pretty consistent across everyone in our industry, and we can go ahead and use that because there really is no differentiator for us in using or building that application ourselves.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Don. And thanks to each of our attendees and for these great questions coming in. We'll try to get to a couple more here in the Q&A box. And then if we don't have time to get to your question on this live webinar, please go ahead and reach out to us at unraveldata.com. Again, thank you, Eric. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Don, for your participation on this panel. Really appreciate the input and this great decision framework that you've provided for us, as well as your feedback and input. And we look forward to hosting our guests on the next webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you.